5 women didn't knock. They didn't cry out. They simply appeared, like ghosts of something too broken to speak, huddled in the back of Amos Cole's barn before dawn. Clothes torn, blood drying, eyes vacant. They were waiting for the next man to take what every man had. But Amos? Amos just stepped back. That's when everything cracked. The morning air was brittle, thin and sharp like it could cut skin if you breathed too hard. Amos Cole had been up since before first light, same as always. Habit, or maybe penance. The land around his ranch was empty for miles, silent and vast like God had taken a step back from this part of the map. He heard it as he passed the barn. Not the rustle of horses, not the scurry of cats. Breathing, but not the natural kind. No, this was human. Controlled, tight, almost like someone trying to disappear into the dark. Amos froze, instincts tightening like a coiled rope. His boots crunched on the dirt as he pushed the barn door open slow, letting in the morning chill. The smell hit him first. Sweat. Dirt. Fear. Then he saw them. 5 women, pressed against the back wall like cornered prey. Torn dresses, tangled hair, streaks of dried blood across their arms and faces. Filthy, starved, half mad with exhaustion. The youngest, maybe 17, looked like she hadn't eaten in days. The oldest, around 40, still bore the kind of beauty men turned cruel for. They didn't scream, didn't speak, just watched him like wolves might, hoping but not expecting. Mercy. One stepped forward. Not far. Just enough to show she'd be the one to take the first blow. Dark hair. Scar across her jaw. Proud despite it all. She didn't blink. Amos raised his hands, not as a threat, but as a surrender. "My name's Amos Cole," he said, voice low and slow like talking to a panicked colt. "There's water, bread. You're welcome to both, no strings." They didn't believe him. Of course they didn't. He saw it in their eyes. These weren't just scared women. They were conditioned. Conditioned to expect pain, to read a man's posture like a trap waiting to spring. And right now, they were bracing for the blow. Amos stepped back. He didn't ask questions, didn't crowd them, just backed out into the sunlight and went for the well. Inside, Ada, the dark-haired one, stood frozen. Her fists clenched, heart thudding like a war drum. One of the girls, Beth, broke first, whispered, "I'm thirsty," like a prayer, then crawled on hands and knees to the door, gulping water like it might vanish. The others followed. Hunger overriding fear. But Ada? She didn't move. She watched that door like it was a lie, because she'd seen this before. The good act, the sugar words, then the trap. Always the trap. And yet, an hour passed, then 2. No man came. Outside, Amos sat on his porch, rifle resting across his lap, gaze locked on the barn. He didn't fidget, didn't pace, just waited, still and burdened, a man with hard years behind him and nothing left to prove. When Clay, his ranch hand, rode in around midday, the tune he was whistling died on his lips the moment he saw Amos's face. "What's happened?" he asked. "Found 5 women in the barn," Amos replied, quiet. Clay swore under his breath. "What are you gonna do?" "Feed them. Keep them safe." "For how long?" "As long as it takes." Clay nodded slowly, but his eyes scanned the hills. "What happens when the men who owned them come looking?" Amos didn't answer right away, just looked toward the barn and said, "I reckon we'll find out soon enough." Out on the frontier, mercy was rarer than rain, and sometimes the smallest act, like offering water instead of harm, was enough to change everything. But kindness has a cost. And Amos Cole? He just bought himself a war. If this story gripped your heart, stick around. What comes next will shatter you. Hit that subscribe button. Don't miss part 2. The barn was too quiet. Not peaceful quiet. Tension quiet. The kind where every breath felt borrowed, and every creak in the wood made the women flinch like a whip had cracked. Ada sat with her back to the wall, arms around Beth, whose thin shoulders trembled against her chest. The water they'd drunk hadn't eased the tightness in their bellies. Hunger and fear had fused too long ago. Trust, even in the form of bread, felt like a trick wrapped in cloth. Suddenly, boots crunched outside the barn. The door creaked open. Ada tensed, ready to throw herself between the others and the man who'd come to collect. But Amos didn't step inside. He just leaned a wrapped bundle and another full pitcher inside the threshold, then backed away without a word. "No strings," he said again, through the slats. Then silence. They waited for the latch to drop, for the sound of a man readying himself to collect what he thought was owed. But it didn't come. Beth whispered, "He left again." Ada didn't answer. She didn't have a name for what she was feeling. Not exactly. Not yet. But it felt like standing barefoot on river ice. Something inside her beginning to thaw, too sudden, too dangerous. Martha moved first, crawling forward and pulling the bundle close. She unwrapped the cloth. Bread, dried meat, 2 old tin mugs, and a folded blanket that smelled of cedar smoke. No demand, no price, just supplies. Sadie stared at the food, then at the door. "Why?" she rasped. It was the first word she'd spoken in over a week. Ada didn't answer. Her eyes were locked on that door, and in the silence that followed, something inside her cracked. Not the numb kind of crack that comes from being beaten again, but the kind that lets light in. And it hurt, because if this man really meant no harm, if he was truly offering kindness with no collar attached, then everything she'd learned about survival, everything she'd become, might crumble. She stood slowly. "I'll speak to him." Martha reached for her hand, but Ada shook her off. She stepped outside into the sun. Amos was sitting on the porch again, whittling a stick like time didn't weigh heavy on his back. He looked up but didn't stand, just nodded once and set the knife down. Ada didn't come closer than 20 feet. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse but carried. "What do you want from us?" Amos leaned forward, elbows on knees. His face was weathered, his eyes distant but steady. "I don't want anything," he said. "I got food, got space. Figured folks needin' rest ought to have both." Ada crossed her arms, still a wall of suspicion and battle-scarred pride. "Men like you don't do this, not without a reason." He looked past her toward the barn. "Had a wife once. Abigail." The way he said her name, it wasn't soft, it was sacred. "She was taken, long time ago. I didn't get there fast enough, and by the time I found her, what was left?" He swallowed. "She was never the same." Ada said nothing, but she felt the shift, the weight in his voice. That was the scar, right there. Not the kind you saw on skin, but the kind that never quit aching. "I don't know who hurt you," he continued, "but I'm not here to take from you. Not now, not ever." His words hung in the dry air, too simple to believe, but too true to ignore. Ada didn't answer. She turned and walked back toward the barn. Inside, the others were watching through the cracks. "Well?" Beth asked. Ada sat down hard on the dirt floor. She exhaled, long and shaking. "I don't know what he is," she whispered, "but he ain't like the others." She didn't say more. But when night fell, they wrapped themselves in the blanket he'd left. And for the first time in years, They slept. No one kept watch. No one clutched a weapon. They drifted off to the sound of a ranch wind through the rafters and a single porch chair rocking slow under the stars. By the third morning, silence had settled into the bones of the barn. Not the cold kind, the one laced with fear and flinching, but something closer to stillness, still fragile, still holding its breath, but no longer bracing for the whip. Beth stirred first. She'd been the youngest, and the thirst had broken her first, too. Her small hands brushed straw from her lap as she blinked at the slatted sunlight crawling across the floor. "Do you think he's still out there?" she whispered. Ada didn't answer. She'd been watching the barn door since before dawn, shoulders tight, jaw locked, always listening, always doubting, because hope, in her world, wasn't light. It was bait. The others were rousing now, sleep-crusted and hollow-eyed but alive. Martha's joints cracked as she sat up beside Sadie, who hadn't said another word since her single rasp the day before. Leah, the skittish one with bruises that hadn't faded yet, curled her arms around her knees. Her eyes darted between Ada and the sunlight like they were competing threats. Beth stood, wobbling. "I need more water." Ada's voice shot out like a warning whip. "Don't!" But the girl had already taken 2 steps. Beth was trembling, legs thin as fence wire, dress hanging off her frame like it belonged to someone else. But her eyes were bright in a way Ada hadn't seen since they fled. Not wild, not broken, hopeful. "I saw him leave it. He didn't touch it, didn't even come near. He just left it again." Martha rose slow, placing a hand on Beth's shoulder. "Let her, Ada." Ada turned sharply. "And if it's drugged? Or he's watching to see who moves first?" Martha's voice was gentle but unshaken. "Then we'll deal with that when it comes. But the girl's thirsty. So are we all." Beth took another step. Her fingers touched the door. For one frozen second, Ada nearly lunged, muscle memory screaming to protect, to stop, to shelter. But she didn't. Beth opened the barn door. Sunlight poured in like it belonged to someone else. And there it was. The pitcher, still full. Clean. Untouched. Beside it, wrapped again in the same checkered cloth, was more bread, a tin of beans, and a folded rag that might have passed for a towel once upon a time. No man in sight. Beth dropped to her knees and drank deep. The water ran down her chin, soaking into her collar. Then she laughed. Just a small sound. Just once. But real. Ada's throat tightened. The others followed cautiously. Martha moved with quiet dignity. Leah clung to Sadie as they crossed the threshold. They drank in silence, faces turning instinctively to the wind, to the sky, to the space. The openness. Ada stayed behind. She couldn't make herself cross that line. Not yet. Beth turned, water still clinging to her lips. "You should come, Ada. It's safe." But that was the one thing Ada didn't know how to believe. Amos watched all of it from a distance. From his porch, his hands wrapped around a chipped enamel mug, he saw the girl drink, saw the others follow, and saw the one who didn't. The leader. Ada. He didn't blame her. He'd seen that kind of fear before. It wasn't fear of pain. It was fear of losing control, of being wrong about something dangerous, of letting the armor drop and finding out, too late, it still wasn't enough. He didn't wave, didn't call out, just sipped his coffee and let them have the space. Because trust, out here, was never taken. Only earned. Back inside the barn, Ada sat beside the empty pitcher. Her fingers tapped lightly against the wood. Not nervous, not anxious, just thinking. "They're starting to believe," she said, more to herself than the others. Martha, folding the cloth into a neat square, looked over. "And you?" Ada didn't answer, but her voice was softer when she said, "He hasn't asked for a thing." "Sometimes," Martha replied, "that's all it takes." Ada stared at the gap in the slats where sunlight carved shapes on the dirt. "No," she whispered. "That's what makes it worse." Martha didn't press. She knew, because kindness from a man was more terrifying than cruelty. Cruelty you could brace for. But kindness? That could trick you into letting go. And when it all turned, as it always did, when the mask fell and the hand clenched, it wasn't just your body that paid. It was your soul. But outside, the porch creaked with no threat. The sun warmed the land without judgment. And for the first time in 6 long years, 5 women sat in silence and didn't feel hunted. The wind had shifted. Not the kind you could measure with a weather vane, but the kind you felt in your gut, a warning that rode the air before trouble showed its face. Clay Branson felt it the moment his horse crested the bluff above the ranch. He'd been riding fence lines since sunup, checking posts and signs of cougar along the ravine trail. But something felt off. Down in the valley, the barn stood still. The house, too. No movement. But the hair on his arms stood up just the same. As he neared, he spotted Amos sitting on the porch, rifle across his lap. Not polishing it, not cleaning it, just holding it, like a man might hold a Bible when the devil came knocking. Clay pulled up, dismounted slow. "You seeing ghosts, or just feeling 'em?" he asked, half joking. Amos didn't smile. "Tracks," he said. "Fresh ones, shod horses, circling wide through the grass, not random, not passing through." Clay's easy posture stiffened. "You think someone's been watching?" Amos nodded, eyes never leaving the distant ridgeline. "Yeah, and they ain't curious. They're patient. That's worse." Inside the barn, Ada was feeding a small portion of beans to Beth and Leah. The younger girls had started eating proper meals, still timid about taking too much. But it was Martha who noticed the change first. She leaned toward the cracks in the barn wall, the ones facing west. "Riders," she whispered, "far off." Ada rose and stepped beside her. Dust moved along the ridge, slow, deliberate. Not a trail, a presence. Silhouettes, men on horseback. 5, maybe more, watching like vultures waiting for something to die. Ada's stomach turned. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the wooden beam. She knew that stillness, that kind of waiting. They weren't Apache. Their posture was different. Saddle-sure and arrogant. Traders or bounty men, the kind who smiled as they bartered for flesh. She swallowed hard. He'd found them. Back on the porch, Clay's voice dropped to a gritty whisper. "Could be nothing. Could be ranch hands looking for strays." "They're not," Amos said. "You know it. I know it." Clay nodded, jaw tight. "You reckon it's them?" "I do." "You gonna send 'em on?" Amos stood. Slow. Heavy, like the weight of what was coming had already started settling across his shoulders. "No," he said. "They ain't taking 'em back. Not while I got breath in me." Clay looked at him hard. "You sure?" "They're not cattle, Clay. They ain't anyone's to claim. Not anymore." Inside the barn, the fear had returned like a dust storm. Quiet at first, then choking. Beth huddled close to Sadie, who had retreated to her usual silence, eyes locked on nothing. Martha paced, her hands wringing the hem of her shirt. Leah had gone pale. Ada stood still. It was like staring down a past you thought you'd outrun, and realizing it had been following you the whole time. She didn't speak, but her jaw set like stone. The door creaked open. Amos didn't enter. He never did. Just leaned in enough for his voice to carry. 5 men, maybe more. Ridge West. You know them? Ada didn't look up. One of them does. The man who bought me. Silence filled the space like a second breath. He ran a trading post near the river. Said I'd work to repay the kindness. He meant other things. What's his name? Amos asked. Cyrus Thorne. Amos said nothing at first, just absorbed it like a punch to the ribs. Thorne's name don't mean nothing on this land, he said. You're under my protection now. The words hung heavy, not because they weren't welcome, but because Ada didn't know how to believe in them. She turned slowly, eyes locking on his through the gap in the barn frame. If you stand between him and us, she said, voice like flint, he'll make it cost you. Amos didn't blink. Then he best come heavy. That night, the riders didn't leave. Their figures stayed on the ridge, unmoving shadows against the dying light, like wolves waiting for the cattle to bolt. Clay stayed up, rifle in hand, pacing slow along the porch. Amos stood with him, quiet, watching. Inside, the women didn't sleep. Fear had returned. But so had something else. Someone had drawn a line for them. A man with no stake in their past, no price on their heads, no chain around their necks. They were still afraid, but they weren't alone. And in a world like this one, that counted for more than 100 prayers. The sun rose mean that morning, low, red, and watching. It didn't warm the land. It only made everything sharp. Clay spotted the riders first. 5 of them, stretched in a loose line along the ridge, their horses' silhouettes dark against the light. He watched through the scope of his rifle, chewing slow on a piece of dried tobacco. They're not moving, he muttered. Just sitting there like buzzards. Amos didn't answer. He stood beside the porch post, his hat tilted low, eyes locked on that horizon. He'd been still since dawn, like a man listening to something only he could hear. The wind carried faint laughter from the ridge, low, mocking. Clay's hand went to his gun. What do you reckon they want? Amos's jaw tightened. Same thing men like that always want. What don't belong to 'em. Inside the barn, Ada saw them through a narrow crack in the wall. Her breath hitched. The man at the front wasn't just another traitor, not just another thief of women. It was him. Cyrus Thorne. She'd know the shape of that body anywhere. The slight tilt of his head, the limp he got from a knife wound he'd never stopped bragging about. He sat his horse like a king surveying his kingdom. Even from that distance, she could feel his presence crawl under her skin. Her hands went cold. Martha saw the change in her face. Who is he? Ada's voice came out in a whisper. The one who bought me. The one who... She couldn't finish. Her lips trembled, her throat closing around the memory. Beth started crying before she even knew why. Leah pulled her close, whispering soft prayers in a language that no god seemed to answer anymore. Ada clenched her fists. Wake the others, she said. They need to see what's coming. Amos stepped off the porch and walked toward the barn, rifle in hand. Clay followed, his boots grinding in the dirt. He didn't knock, didn't open the door, just spoke through it, like always. Riders on the ridge, he said. You know 'em? Ada's voice came, strained, trembling but steady. Yes, Cyrus Thorne. Clay spat in the dirt. Hell of a name for a man like that. Amos looked toward the ridge again. He the one? The one who kept us, sold us, rented us. Amos's shoulders squared. His voice turned to steel. He's not taking you anywhere, not while I'm breathing. Inside, Ada froze. The words sank deep, simple, Final, impossible. Protection. No one had ever said that word to her without it costing something. By afternoon, the riders moved closer. Not close enough for bullets, just close enough for a message. The man in front lifted a hand, shouting across the distance. "Cole, that you?" His voice carried slick and steady, like a snake that had learned to talk. Amos said nothing. Thorne smiled, his teeth flashing white under his wide-brimmed hat. "Appreciate you taking care of my property, but it's time to hand him over." He paused, letting the words hang. "You can name your price. We're reasonable men." Clay's grip tightened on the rifle. "He's lying, Amos. You know that." Amos nodded once. "Yeah, I do." He stepped forward into the sunlight. The lamplight caught the scar on his cheek, the lines carved deep from too many years of silence. His voice, when it came, was calm. "The women ain't leaving." Thorne's smile died slow. "You sure you want to do that, friend?" "Not your friend," Amos said, "and not your property." A long silence stretched between them, hot, brittle, and dangerous. Then Thorne spat in the dirt and tugged his reins. "You just bought yourself a heap of misery, rancher." Amos tipped his hat once, eyes cold as iron. "Wouldn't be my first." When the riders turned back toward the ridge, Ada's knees gave out. She sank to the floor, shaking. "He told him no," she whispered. "He told him no." Martha knelt beside her, one hand gripping her shoulder. "You hear that?" Ada nodded, tears stinging her eyes. Beth spoke from the corner, voice small but fierce. "Does that mean we're safe now?" Ada looked toward the light slanting through the boards. Outside, she could hear the wind picking up, the kind that carries the smell of blood and gunpowder. "No," she said softly. "It means it's only begun." That night, the ridge burned with campfire light. The men didn't leave. They were waiting, watching, measuring the time between now and dawn. In the house, Amos cleaned his rifle while Clay counted cartridges. Neither spoke much. Through the small window, the two men could see the distant fires flickering like the eyes of wolves. Amos said, "When it breaks, it'll break fast." Clay nodded. "We got maybe 5, maybe 6 guns. They got twice that. Then we make the first shot count." In the barn, Ada lay awake. Her body was trembling, but not from fear this time, from something sharper, heavier, because for the first time since she'd been taken, someone had chosen to stand for her, not over her. And that, she thought, might be the most dangerous thing of all. Through a thin crack in the barn wall, Ada saw the man who'd stolen 6 years of her life. He sat tall in the saddle like a man who'd never once had to earn the ground under him. The tilt of his head, slightly to the left, was unmistakable. An old bullet graze had left him lopsided, but it never slowed his cruelty. Cyrus Thorne. The sound of that name alone made her stomach clench. She'd hoped he was dead, or lost to some border skirmish. But there he was, alive, smug, and surrounded by his usual pack of wolves, hired men, violent for coin, loyal only to power. Beth was beside her, clutching a handful of straw like it might anchor her. "Is it him?" she whispered. Ada nodded once. "It's him." Martha went still. Sadie closed her eyes and didn't open them again. Leah backed into the darkest corner of the barn. No one had to say what they were thinking. "He's come to take us back." Ada stood, breathing shallow. Her voice was flat. "Wake the others. No more pretending we're safe." Amos had already seen them. 5 riders, maybe more, waiting behind the ridge. Their formation wasn't casual. This wasn't a search party. This was a retrieval. Clay sat on the porch rail, watching through narrowed eyes. Looks like they're waiting on something. You recognize the one up front? Amos nodded. Cyrus Thorne, slave trader, operated east of the Pecos before the war. Clay cursed under his breath. He's got papers on him? Likely. Falsified or not, he'll wave them like scripture. Clay adjusted the strap on his rifle. Then the law won't mean a damn thing. No, Amos said. Out here it rarely does. He stood slow, his boots grinding against the dry porch boards. But my word's worth something, at least to me. He found Ada standing just inside the barn, her back rigid, eyes locked on the approaching figures like she was preparing for war. You know him? He asked. Yes, she replied. Her voice didn't shake. He bought me from Apache traders 6 winters ago, kept me in a tent like an animal, rented me out to whoever had coin. He's not a man, he's rot in boots. Amos nodded, steady. Then he's not getting you back. Ada blinked. Just like that? Just like that. She studied him, searching for the lie, the angle, the fine print. She didn't find any. That scared her more than Thorne did. Late afternoon, the riders moved closer. Not fast, not hostile. Just enough to let everyone know they weren't bluffing. Cyrus called out, smooth as ever. Cole, you got my girls in that barn? Amos stepped into the open, rifle slung but ready. They ain't yours. Cyrus chuckled like they were discussing cattle prices. I got bills of sale, got names, signatures, legal and proper. If you're holding them, that's theft. They're people, Amos said. You can't own people. Cyrus's smile didn't reach his eyes. That's a sweet thought, but it don't hold weight in these parts. Now, I don't want trouble. You hand 'em over, I hand you a finder's fee. $200. Easy money for a man living alone. Behind Amos, Clay appeared with a second rifle. He ain't alone. Cyrus's expression cooled. You sure about this, Cole? Amos didn't blink. You ride off now, and we pretend this never happened. A pause. Cyrus spat into the dust. Then it's going to be blood. Amos said nothing, just stood there, still and unshaken. Inside the barn, the women huddled together. But this time it wasn't fear that bound them. It was fury. He called us his, Martha whispered. Ada clenched her fists. He always did. Beth looked toward the door. Is Mr. Cole really going to stop him? Ada nodded slowly. He already did. That night, the fire on the ridge burned like a threat. Thorne's men didn't leave. They circled, paced, watched. Amos sat cleaning his rifle with quiet purpose. Clay double-checked the powder stores. They both knew what was coming. They'll wait till dawn, Clay said. Try to catch us tired. Amos looked towards the barn. Let him try. He wasn't a man used to defending things, but tonight, that changed. Tonight, he wasn't guarding a barn. He was standing between 5 broken souls and the devil who broke them. The light was dying when Thorne rode back in. This time he didn't sit up on the ridge like some king waiting on tribute. He came down slow, his horse kicking dust in lazy clouds. 4 of his men fanned out behind him like wolves pretending to be curious. He stopped 20 paces from the porch. Amos was already there. No shotgun blast, no shouting. Just 2 men standing on opposite ends of something invisible. A line that hadn't been there yesterday, but would never be forgotten after today. Thorne's voice was syrupy smooth. Evening, Cole. Amos didn't return the pleasantry. You're making this harder than it needs to be, Thorne continued, smiling like he was still trying to sell something. Ain't no sense in bleeding over a handful of damaged goods. I pay for what's mine. I got proof, and I don't take kindly to theft. They're not yours, Amos said, voice low and final. Thorne leaned in the saddle, cocked his head. You're really willing to die for them? Women you just met? That ain't noble. That's foolish. Behind the screen door, Clay stood with his rifle aimed center chest. He didn't speak. From inside the barn, the women were silent too, but they were listening. Every word, every breath. Ada stood just inside the slats, her heart pounding not with fear, but fury. Thorne shifted in the saddle again. All right, he said, pretending patience. Let's make it civil. I'll take the older two, Ada and Martha. You keep the others. They ain't worth much anyhow. I'm giving you a deal. Amos took one step off the porch. Not quick, not threatening, just steady. Get back on your horse, he said, and ride the way you came. You don't get it, do you? Thorne's smile fell. You're not stopping a damn thing. You're just buying time. I got more men riding in from Elkhorn, and when they come, we'll burn that barn and bury whoever's left. Then you better start digging, Amos said. Clay chambered around with a loud click that cracked through the silence like a warning shot that hadn't yet been fired. Thorne glared, the smile long gone now. You ain't law, he spat. No, Amos replied. I'm worse. I'm a man with nothing left to lose. For a heartbeat, it seemed like Thorne might draw. He didn't. Instead, he turned his horse, spitting hard into the dust, and rode off. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Night came heavy and long. No moon, just the sound of horses in the distance, and firelight flickering like angry eyes along the ridge. Inside the house, Amos cleaned his rifle slow. Clay stacked canned goods in the corner, ammo beside them. Come dawn, Clay said. We either stand or we bury. Amos didn't reply right away. He stared at the door like it might open to something holy or hellish. I ain't letting them go back, he finally said, even if it means I don't see another sunrise. In the barn, Ada couldn't sleep. She lay curled in the straw, staring at the rafters, hands twitching with memories that wouldn't die. But she didn't feel small anymore. Not tonight. She rose and walked out. The air was cool, still. The house glowed faintly with oil light. Amos sat on the porch. When she stepped into view, he looked up, but didn't stand. Ada stopped at the bottom step. Her voice was quiet. Why? He didn't pretend to misunderstand. He set the rifle down gently. Because I've stood by once already while someone I loved suffered, and it chewed me up inside. I ain't making that mistake twice. Ada swallowed hard. She was your wife? Her name was Abigail. A long pause stretched between them. He's not taking you, Amos said. Not while I got a breath left. Ada's throat tightened. I've had men promise things before, she whispered. Then make me pay double. I ain't them, he said. She looked at him then. Really looked. And saw it wasn't a line, wasn't a trick. It was a vow already carved into him. And something cracked in her. Not fear, not pain. Something buried. She stepped up onto the porch, sat down near the edge. Close, but not too close. They sat in silence, the dust of the day still settling around them. You ever think, she asked, that maybe the land remembers what men do to each other? Amos took a long breath. Maybe that's why it's so damn dry. Dawn came slow, like it was afraid of what waited on the other side of night. The sky bruised from black to gray, and with it came the hush that always slips in before something breaks, like the breath before a rifle cracks. Amos Cole stood in the yard, boots planted in dry earth, hands steady on the barrel of his Winchester. Clay paced near the barn, eyes sweeping the ridgelines. He hadn't said a word in 10 minutes, which meant he was thinking in kill distances. Inside the house, Beth and Sadie cried softly into each other's arms. Leah sat with her back to the wall, fingernails dug into the wood like she was trying to stay present. Martha was already in the kitchen, stacking jars, handing out knives like they were some kind of comfort. And Ada? She was outside. She stood near the well, arms crossed, hair braided tight down her back, face set like stone. She didn't ask for a rifle. Didn't need one. She was one now. Amos didn't tell her to go inside. He knew better. Some folks didn't hide when hell rode in. They looked it square in the eyes. From the east, a shimmer of dust danced low on the horizon. Horses, 7, maybe 8 riders. And at the head, Thorn. He'd come back, just like he said. And this time he wasn't selling anything. He was collecting. Amos took a breath that scraped his chest. "They're comin'." Clay spat into the dirt. "Then we make 'em regret it." The first shot didn't come from Amos. It came from the ridge. A sharp crack. One of Thorn's men dropped, his horse bucking wildly. Clay grinned. "Forgot I set a trap up there." Thorn's men scattered, diving for cover, returning fire blindly. Bullets thudded into barnwood and sent up splinters from the porch railing. Inside, Martha pulled the younger girls under the table. "Keep your heads low," she barked, like she'd done this before, and maybe she had. Amos fired once, then again. Calm, measured. One rider caught a bullet in the leg and toppled hard. Another crawled behind a rock, screaming for someone named Luke who wasn't answering anymore. The fight wasn't clean, wasn't heroic. It was sweat and blood and smoke that burned your eyes. It was clay dust turning to mud under a boot heel soaked in red. It was a man dragging his last breath across the dirt and not even knowing why anymore. Thorn charged last. Straight through the gate, yelling like a demon, face twisted, revolver raised. And Ada stepped in front of him. No weapon. Just her. He slowed, confused, just for a second. "You got no say in this, girl." Ada didn't flinch. "You've already taken everything you're gonna take." That's when Amos fired. One shot, right into Thorn's chest. He fell like a tree split in half, eyes wide, mouth gaping like he never thought it'd end this way. It always ends this way. The silence that followed was ugly. Not peaceful. Just empty. Like the land itself was holding its breath. Clay walked among the bodies, kicked a rifle away from a twitching hand. "Ain't gonna be no funeral," he muttered. Martha helped clean wounds. One of the girls had a graze to the arm. Clay had a cracked rib. Amos had powder burns on his neck. But they were alive. That's what mattered. Later that evening, as the sun bled orange into the hills, Ada sat beside Amos on the porch steps. She didn't speak for a while. When she did, it wasn't a thank you. It was something harder. "I ain't someone easy to save," she said, voice low, almost bitter. Amos leaned back against the post. "Good. I ain't someone who saves people." They sat in silence again. Dust swirled in the yard, catching the last of the light like gold flakes. "Thorn's gone," Ada finally said. "Yeah, but what about the rest? The law, the town, folks who think we don't belong here?" Amos stared out across the land. His land. "This place was built by folks who didn't belong," he said. "Every fence, every nail, every acre of it, paid for by someone's blood. If they come for you again, they're gonna have to come through me." She didn't cry. Didn't smile either. But for the first time, she looked like she might believe him. The days that followed the gunfire settled like dust over a worn saddle. Quiet, but never quite still. Amos patched the porch rail while Clay wrangled up strays spooked by the shooting. The horses hadn't run far, just enough to remind them all that fear still had legs. Inside the house, the women tried to live like normal folk again. Martha scrubbed blood from the floorboards, hands raw and red. Sadie sang softly while she folded linens, her voice too thin for the tune to carry. Beth chased a barn cat with a laugh that sounded almost real, but the air still held weight. The kind of weight you don't shake. You carry it. Ada carried it more than most. She stood alone behind the barn one morning, a folded piece of paper in her hand. The wax seal cracked beneath her thumb. The last tether to the world she'd come from. The letter had arrived in a dusty envelope, delivered by a boy who didn't stick around long enough for water. Amos found her reading it by the corral, her face unreadable, but her hands shaking just enough to give her away. "News from back home?" he asked, staying a few paces back. Ada didn't answer right off, just stared out toward the hills like the words might float away if she looked hard enough. "They found her," she said finally. "My little sister. Alive." Amos's breath hitched in his throat. She was taken by another trader, sold off to some rancher in Montana Territory. The marshal there tracked her down. She's safe now, in a mission school. Says she still remembers my name. Her voice cracked then, a fracture in all that iron. Amos stepped closer. "That's damn good news." Ada gave a slow nod, but joy didn't sit easy on her face. Just something more complicated, relief tangled with guilt. "I thought she was dead, Amos. I buried that grief. Deep. Now it's clawing its way back out, and I don't know what to do with it." "You do what you can," he said, soft as morning light. "You go to her." Ada looked at him, really looked. "You think I should go?" "I think you have to," he replied. "You've fought your way through hell for her. Now she needs her sister. Ain't no shame in going where love pulls you." She smiled, just barely. "And you?" He tipped his hat back, revealing eyes that had seen too many people leave. "I'll be here. Ain't going nowhere." That night, the fire crackled low in the hearth while Clay packed jerky and dry biscuits into a worn satchel. He was going to ride partway with Ada come sunrise, see her safely through the first 100 miles. Sadie handed Ada a thin shawl. "It's not much, but it's warm." Martha pressed a tin of salve into her palm. "For saddle sores. Trust me." Even little Beth came up with a braid of dried lavender. "Mama said it keeps bad dreams away." Ada, who never cried, had to turn away for a moment. Her throat was full. Amos waited until the others turned in. Then he stepped out onto the porch where Ada stood beneath the stars, wind tugging gently at her coat. "I ain't good at goodbyes," he said. "Then don't say one," she replied. "Just tell me this place'll still be here if I come back." He looked out at the land, scarred but stubborn. The corral, the fields, the house patched with bullet holes and hope. "It'll be here," he said. "So will I." She reached for his hand. Rough fingers met calloused ones. "I don't belong to this land," she whispered, "but somehow it knows me now." "You bled for it. That's as much a claim as any deed." Ada took a breath that steadied her soul. "Then maybe I'll come back one day. Not just to visit, but to build something that don't fall apart." "You'll have help," he said, eyes locked on hers. And just before the sun breached the edge of the earth, Ada rode out. Not as a fugitive, not as someone running from something, but toward something, toward a sister, toward a second chance. And behind her, Amos stood with his hand resting on the post she once leaned against, watching until the dust from her horse settled and the road turned to memory. The wind came hard that morning, pushing tumbleweeds across the yard like ghosts in a hurry. Amos stood on the porch, rifle in hand, boots rooted like fence posts. Clay was up on the rise, keeping watch through a spyglass. The women stayed inside the house, their fear so thick it hung like smoke behind the windows. But Ada, she had returned. Not 2 days after riding out, she'd come galloping back down the ridge, breathless and fierce, like she'd outrun the devil himself. When Amos asked why, she only said, "Because the fight ain't done." Now it was here. A black line of riders crested the far ridge like thunderclouds on horseback. Cyrus Thorne led the pack, his long coat flapping in the wind like a vulture's wings, his eyes dead and sure. He didn't come to talk. He came to reclaim. Amos swallowed hard. "Get the women to the cellar." But the door creaked open behind him before he could finish. Ada stepped out, hair braided tight, jaw locked, eyes sharp as arrowheads. "I'm not hiding." "Wasn't asking you to hide," Amos said low. "Was asking you to be smart." She squared her shoulders. "I've done enough hiding in this life." He knew better than to argue. The horses came down the hill slow, measured, cruel, men with rifles and rope. One of them spat on the ground when he saw Ada. Another licked his lips. Thorne reined in just 10 feet from the porch. His voice rolled out like molasses soaked in poison. "You know why I'm here?" Amos didn't flinch. "You rode all this way for a lie." Thorne grinned. "That ain't a lie. That's merchandise. Mine." Ada stepped forward. "You don't own me." Thorne's grin vanished. "I bought you. Paid good coin. You disappeared. That's theft." Ada's voice didn't shake. "Then consider this my repayment." And she spit in the dirt between them. Thorne's hand twitched toward his gun. Amos moved before he knew he was moving, stepping in front of Ada, shoulders broad, rifle lowered but ready. The barrel gleamed in the morning sun. "You fire that pistol," Amos said, "and you better pray your boys shoot straighter than I do." There was a beat, a stillness before the storm. Then something strange happened. The door behind them cracked open again. Beth stepped out, barefoot and pale, holding only a kitchen knife. Behind her came Martha, clutching a rusted axe, and Sadie, trembling but upright, a cast iron skillet in both hands. Leah was the last, half her face still bruised from weeks ago, but her eyes burning with rage. They moved as one, slowly, silently, not warriors, but witnesses, the kind of witnesses who make evil blink. Thorne's men shifted in their saddles. One of them lowered his rifle, another cursed under his breath. Ada raised her chin. "You want me, Thorne? Come take me." Her voice cracked just once, but that crack split the sky. Thorne didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared at the 5 women, bloody, bruised, barefoot, and the man standing in front of them like a shield made of bone and promise. And in that moment, the whole thing broke, not with a shot, not with blood, but with silence. One of Thorne's riders turned his horse around, then another. Thorne cursed, called them cowards, but he knew. This fight was lost, not to bullets, but to something harder to kill. Dignity, love, hell, maybe even hope. He spat in the dirt. "Ain't the last you seen of me." Amos didn't blink. "I'll sleep just fine with that." Thorne rode off in a storm of hooves and dust, trailing fewer men than he brought. Ada exhaled for the first time in what felt like years. Her knees nearly buckled, but Amos caught her elbow. "You all right?" "No," she whispered. "But I'm free." Behind them, the women crumpled to the porch, sobbing, laughing, broken in a brand new way. Beth wept into Martha's lap. Sadie sat on the step, staring up at the sky like she was seeing it for the first time. No one said the word victory, because it didn't feel like that. It felt like something older, quieter, heavier. A beginning carved out of survival. And as the sun began its slow climb over the far ridge, Amos looked out at the land. The dust would settle. The scars would stay. But the house was still standing. And so were they. Spring came late that year, as if the land itself had been holding its breath. It started with the cottonwoods near the creek, leaves unfurling like cautious hands, shaking off the memory of frost. Then came the bird song, hesitant at first, then bold. And somewhere in the middle of it all, life began again at the Cole Ranch. No one really spoke of that morning on the porch. It lived in their eyes, in the way Sadie flinched at loud voices, or how Beth refused to go anywhere alone for weeks. But the violence didn't define them anymore. Not here. Not now. Amos fixed the barn roof first. Said it was to keep the hay dry, but Ada knew better. It was about mending things. He worked slow, steady, like he had time now, like something inside him had stopped running. Martha found her way into the garden. She planted wildflowers where the old chicken coop used to be. The soil was stubborn and dry, but she coaxed life out of it anyway, soft hands turning hard with effort, her back bowed like the rows she tilled. Beth took to the horses. No one taught her. She just understood them. She'd sit in the sun with her arms wrapped around a dapple-gray mare, humming some tune no one else knew. And when the nightmares came, she'd walk the pasture in moonlight, whispering to the animals until dawn came to chase the shadows off. Leah took longer, always watching, always weighing. But one morning she walked into town with Clay and bought fabric, bold reds and deep browns, and stitched dresses by lantern light. No one asked why. No one had to. Sadie didn't speak until the day a rattler coiled by the porch step, and Amos instinctively shoved her aside, taking the bite on his boot instead. She screamed his name, clear and sharp, and just like that, the silence broke. After that, her words returned in slow drips, like rain after drought. And Ada. She walked the land. She learned where the wild mint grew, where the creek ran deepest, where Abigail's grave sat beneath a crooked cedar. She cleaned the headstone every Sunday, brought wildflowers, sometimes said nothing, sometimes everything. One afternoon, she found Amos standing near that very grave, a jar of nails in one hand, a hammer in the other. He was fixing the fence that had fallen along the back ridge, just like always. Quiet, steady, alone. But this time, she stayed. He didn't turn to her right away, just kept hammering, slow and sure. "I reckon you could leave if you wanted," he said. "Ain't no law holding you here." "I know," she said. He drove another nail. "So why are you still standing there?" Ada looked out over the hills, golden with new grass. "Because no one ever fought for me before," she answered. "And now I want to build something worth that fight." He finally turned. His face wasn't soft. Amos Cole didn't do soft, but something in his eyes, weathered and weary, held a flicker of warmth. He held out a hand, not to take, not to lead, but to walk beside her, and Ada, no longer trembling, no longer anyone's to own, placed her hand in his. Not as a victim, not as a burden, but as an equal. They walked the ridge together, the land rolling out like a promise ahead of them. Down below, the others laughed near the clothesline. Beth chasing Sadie with a wet shirt, Martha yelling about her tomatoes, Leah pretending not to smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. The past hadn't disappeared. Scars remained, some visible, some not. But they didn't own them anymore. They were just part of the map now. That night, as the sun bled into the horizon, painting everything in gold and dust, Amos sat on the porch steps with Ada beside him. No words passed for a while, just the creak of wood the rustle of wind, the soft clatter of supper dishes being washed indoors. After a time, he said, "Funny thing about healing. Don't feel like a lightning strike. Feels more like watching grass grow." Ada nodded. Slow. Quiet. But sure. He looked out toward the grave, then back at the house, the barn, the people who had once been broken, and now were something else entirely. "You think we're doing right by her?" he asked. Ada took a deep breath. "I think we're doing what she would have done, and I think that's enough." The stars came out slow, blinking into place like old friends finding their way home. And as night settled over the ranch, the house didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt full of laughter, of life, of second chances. Out here, healing don't come with time. It comes with choice, with grit, with kindness shown where none was owed. So ask yourself, if it was your land, your porch, your second chance, what would you build with it? If this story stirred something in you, don't just scroll on. Subscribe and ride with us for the next tale from the wild places where hearts still fight to be whole.